So
Mazel tov.
very good.
Yeah.
So we are in. We started last week. We started the second Torah portion in the book of Leviticus, which, as we've discussed, it deals with offerings, very holy exercises that none of us have ever seen, and really, not only is that we haven't seen them, but they're really outside the scope of our normal reference because we don't do these things, and they're going to sound kind of off center for the way we think. So while we very much believe that there was tremendous sanctity and importance to what was done and what the Torah prescribes, I'm going to hit. I'm sorry. I'm going to hit mute all just to make sure there's no background noise. And while we see this is having tremendous import at its time, and it also has tremendous import even today, even though we're not going to follow through the exercises, there is the spiritual element of the exercise, because these were not just about physical exercise. What we're seeing described in the Torah is overwhelmingly do this, take this, and it's the animal body parts. It's not such easy reading, pleasant stuff. But so there's the function, but really, even when the function was done, what was very critical to the exercise, or perhaps most critical to the exercise, was the spiritual dynamics that fed and enlivened the function. So we want to focus on that as much as possible. We want to understand what the Torah is saying to the extent we can, but we also want to be able to draw personal lessons from these Torah portions, from these Torah ideas, both into what the spiritual rhythm of what was being represented in the Torah, and then there was more side allegorical things. So one of the things we and I didn't send that piece of paper because it wasn't needed, the prior page, the opening verse in the Torah portion tells us that when one brought an offering, a specific type of offering that was all consumed, it was supposed to be burned in the course of the day on the altar, and if not let it burn through the night, it had to be done by the next morning. And one of the things that I mentioned, and it probably will come up again today, is that in the temple in general, there was a system that was not the normal Jewish system. The normal Jewish system we look at a day as beginning, a calendar day as beginning with night. Today is the 22nd day of Sivan, and that started last night, and it'll go through until nightfall tonight, and when it turns the calendar, and that's why Yom Kippur begins with Kol Nidre Shabbos, Friday night, all of that. It's not Yom Kippur Eve; it's Yom Kippur, Friday night. The Kol Nidre night, if Eve means before. In the temple, it worked with a night following day, the way we normally think in the American calendar. And I'm going to speak about a little bit why that was, but here he says, so the day's offering, in order for it to be totally consumed within the day, the daytime offering, it had up until the next daybreak. So in other words, that was the unit of the day, starting from daybreak or sunrise until the following daybreak or sunrise. So we talk about the burning of the fire on the altar. And if you think about it, the altar was the entire temple and the altar in general, they were very central focal points of Jewish life. The temple was the heart of our people there in Jerusalem. And what went on there was all eyes were there. And the fire on the altar represents, it had to be a perpetual fire. That's where the idea of a ner tamid comes from. In synagogues, of having a perpetual fire, because that was the idea of the light of God and the light of the divine consciousness and divine goodness that's never extinguished, even in times of darkness. And that's an important element of what this is. You say that there's the nighttime and there's the daytime, and there's nothing wrong with nighttime morally, but if we think about our own psychological journeys, there are times which are brighter, and we can call them allegorically daytime. And there are times which are they're a little cloudier. I don't know what to call it. Dark. It's not as bright, and even it's something where it's overcast, and that those life's journey has those ups and downs. And in spirituality too, there are times we feel more connected, which we would call more of a spiritual daytime or springtime, and less connected, which would be more a time when we're feeling spiritual darkness. We don't have the illumination, the internal illumination that we would love to have. So in Torah thinking, the idea of having a spiritual daytime is certainly something we yearn for. At the same time, and I'm saying this as a preface to where we're going now, one of the beauties we can do as human beings, because God didn't create us to have an easy time, in case you haven't noticed. And the journey always has challenges and ups and downs, and maybe we not have to challenges today. We always want to have manageable ones we see as manageable. But it's we're not designed to just have it smooth sailing. Certainly it's meant to have challenges, and the test is how we deal with the challenge. So in that kind of sense, the daytime is great, but in a way it's more prep for the nighttime, spiritually speaking, because where the rubber hits the road and where our humanity and our spiritual connections and our relationships often are tested, there's not in the daytime. There's the fair weather friends are one thing. We just to be able to see who's with us in the nighttime, or to be able to maintain our proper focus in a time when it's not so easy to be able to do that. That's where the real crux of the human experience and human growth is. So in that at that level, you think in Torah thinking, and this is an idea that's I'm just trying to key up the Hasidic insight on 37, something that it doesn't say here, but that is but it's brought in connection with it. We pray 3 times a day. We pray in the morning, we pray in the afternoon, we pray in the evening. Now, biblically, if you look at the Talmudic thinking, biblically we actually only have 2 prayer sessions, and they mirror offerings brought in the temple. In the temple, there was every morning a certain perpetual offering was brought to open the day, and then whatever went on. And I mentioned this last week, I think, and then whatever offerings went on, and then there was one to close out the day, and that was in the late afternoon. So one was called the perpetual one of the shacharit, which is what we call today the morning service, and one was called the perpetual tamid of mincha, which is the afternoon service. And those 2 are fixed. And then the Talmud tells us that we also have traditionally been doing an evening service, and it's more. And again, in words of the Talmud, it's optional, but we've accepted as binding. But it on the scale of obligation, it seems to be of a lower tier from the Talmud. Now, in Hasidic thought, we say that the actual, when it comes to our connection with God and our connection with our deepest selves, the real the primary prayer exercise is the evening prayer, with the one which Torah doesn't tell us to do, and which is not what we see as more biblically set. And the idea is that nighttime is, again, spiritual nighttime, but perhaps also in what we call nighttime, is when it's hardest to find the connection. So if we wanted to look through the hours of the day and see them first in that way, and then use that as a portal to see the psycho-spiritual, what Hasidic thought tells us is that the morning and afternoon prayer, as important as they are, they're really just a way, they are really a way primarily of us gathering spiritual juice, charging our batteries to be able pray properly nighttime, because that's when it's not as easy. And think about in the psycho-spiritual idea, not just in the hours where we talk of day in a concrete sense. It's the good times are times for us to soak in and to not just party. Party is good, but the idea of soaking in the spirituality and soaking in the holy moments, and soaking in the consciousness, to be able to refer back when it's not as clear and illumination doesn't come as easily. So in that vein of thinking, let's take a look at what it says here, all night. That it could be all night on the altar. It says the fire on the altar, it's on 37 to the left, was kept burning throughout the night, indicating that it is possible to bring divine light to even the darkest spiritual moments. So through the night, and again, we're not making any moral judgment about nights, but night does mean something in the spiritual sense, that there isn't the illumination. So we wanted that fire, the fire of the daytime, to keep burning through the night. In other words, that even in the darkest spiritual moments, we should have access to light. Spiritually, the fire derived its ability to illuminate the night, thereby prevailing over the natural darkness of the night from the divine fire that descended upon the altar to devour the sacrifices. So what they're referring to here is that the Talmud tells us that when we brought, there was always fire on the altar, but and they literally lit. But when offerings would first come up in the day, a fire would come from heaven. There would be a heavenly, miraculous fire, and then we would add to it. So what he's saying here is that this miraculous fire that descended on the altar is what gave us the ability and the inspiration to bring our own light and even into the night. In another way, the same idea, the Torah tells us that, Jewish law tells us that prophecy was really restricted fundamentally to people who were in the land of Israel. You needed proper framing and proper physical posture and conditions, material conditions, human conditions, geographical conditions, to be able to be set for prophecy. You couldn't prophesy at will. Moses could, nobody else. So the part of that posture was to be in Israel. Yet, similarly, although the spirit of prophecy does not initially rest on an individual outside the land of Israel, a prophet who began prophesying within the Holy Land can do so outside the Holy Land. This was the case with the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel was from Israel, and the prophet Ezekiel did prophesy in Israel, but the prophet Ezekiel was one of the prophets of the Babylonian exile. And he lived in Babylonia, and he was still a prophet. So that kind of runs against the case of saying, the idea of saying that you can only have prophecy in Israel when Ezekiel did. And the idea is that Ezekiel, because he prepared himself, and he initially launched his prophetic relationship in Israel, he was able to take it afterwards to Babylonia. Thus, although Jewish law generally views night as the first half of the following day, in the case of the sacrifice, night is considered an extension of the previous day, and that sacrifices offered up on a specific day may continue to burn into the night. So here we're finding an insight, more of a spiritual insight, into why the offerings have a different structure of day than our normal Jewish life. Normal Jewish life, the idea is that we assume that there's the darkness, and to us to always recognize that even if things start off in darkness, there's light around the corner, and we look forward to illumination. So every day we begin at nighttime, and with the optimistic perspective and projection that light is coming. I'll go to bed. When I wake up, it's going to be a different day, and there's the illumination, which is a nice thing. With the altar, with the offerings, was different in the sense that we say when you have illumination, when you have a spiritual illumination, you want to be able to bring that into the night, and therefore the night itself will become illuminated. This is indeed a principle that we can bear in mind when we find ourselves in moments of spiritual night. We can extend the spiritual inspiration of our holy days and moments into times of darkness and night. We don't need to be alone or bereft of spiritual inspiration, even though those times come and go for everybody. If we prepare and we think, and we say, that in times when we feel spiritually connected, to kind of put our mind's eye at times when we don't, and try to take it with us, and also our times of spiritual feeling a little bit spiritually alone, to be able to refer back in our minds to times when we didn't, to maybe feel some of that closeness and the warmth of what we felt in easier times, spiritually easier times. Okay. Now, the next one, unless there are questions. Okay. All night until morning. So that's what it said on that previous verse. Now, here they quote a great sage, a Moroccan sage, a Sephardic sage. His name is Rabbi ben Attar. He moved to Jerusalem at the end of his life, and the later half of his life, the later part of his life, and there's a synagogue in the old city. He wrote a book called Chaim. There's the Chaim synagogue in the old city. He was quite a figure. And it says here, in the words of the 18th century Moroccan sage, Rabbi ben Attar, who was a Torah commentator, but he was a Torah sage and a Kabbalist. He writes that this entire passage is a reference to exile and redemption. He says that night refers to the dark night of exile, during which we suffer the pains of oppression, and morning refers to the dawn of redemption, when God will finally reveal his glory upon us and a new era will begin. So he says that because there is a commonly used metaphor in Jewish thinking. We talk about the sufferings of the Jewish people. We had hundreds of years in the first temple where we lived well spiritually and materially. And then the Babylonians came, destroyed the temple, took us off as slaves, and there was suffering, and Israel was demolished and devastated. And even after 70 years, when Jews came back, it took a long time to rebuild Israel and to rebuild a Jewish commonwealth. But eventually they had it. It wasn't as great as the first, but it had it. We had autonomy, self-determination for some period of time. And then after 420 years, that temple was destroyed. And then we suffered a lot. Thank God in America, those of us who've lived here and born here, and I think that the American Jewish experience has been relative, on the scope of the past couple thousand years, has been a dream. Our ancestors could only have dreamed of this amount of acceptance and freedom and the ability for religious expression and really inequality in society. But this is in the scope of Jewish history. The American experience is very much minority. That's not how we lived, and if we were allowed to live, Jews were very, very, very disadvantaged and persecuted. And in Jewish thinking, we call that the night of exile. Exile means the idea of being ripped apart, away from a source, a security, a place of security. And redemption means being able to be freed of those forces tearing us away from who we need to be and our people and our land, and allowing us to be who we want to be. So in the scope of, even though we can be today who we want to be politically, but emotionally, spiritually, it's not as simple as that. And therefore we still call this an exile, and we look forward to Mashiach, who will get rid of all evil and all political issues, but also help us free ourselves spiritually and psychologically, because that is still a battle within each of us to be able to be who we need to be. So he says morning, when we're talking about here in the Torah, that there's the fire burns through the night. There's the idea of the night of exile. Again, it's metaphorically It's the idea where there isn't the illumination, there isn't the connection, the exile, the suffering of the Jewish people. And we look forward to the morning, and the morning is Mashiach, the dawn of redemption. So now he asks, when will that morning be? So he makes a calculation. The scripture tells us, Psalm tells us that in God's eyes, 1,000 years is considered a day. Okay? On the face of it, what the scripture wants to say, that God is beyond time and God doesn't get phased by time. But if you want to take it literally, it's 1,000 years. A millennium is like one day to God. So if you follow that framework, that key, the first half of every millennium is the night. Midway through the millennium begins the day. If in the way we, not in the temple, but in the normal way we think of night and day, a day, or actually a calendar day, begins at night, goes through the day. So if you split it in half, roughly, so then the first half of the calendar day is night, the second half of the calendar day is daylight. If that's the case, the first half of every millennium is its night, and midway through the millennium begins the day. This is Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar making the calculation. So one of the things that Isaiah, there's a verse in Isaiah that says, the prophet says to God, be their strength in the mornings. Not in the morning, but in the mornings, plural. In the plural, meaning that a maximum of 2 mornings will pass once the Jews go into exile, needing God to strengthen them. That there's going to be, as we go forward, heading towards Mashiach, there's going to be mornings where God has to strengthen us. That at least two second halves of millennium. After passing the second one at the latest, the redemption will surely begin. So Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar says, from this period of history, from when Isaiah said it, there's going to be at least 2 millennium mornings, and then he says, assures us the redemption will surely begin. So now let's look at what this means on a calendar, on a timeline. The present exile began with the destruction of the Second Temple in the Jewish year 3830, 70 CE, which the first morning, midpoint of a millennium, after that was the Jewish year 4500. After this time once we went into exile, so following Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar's calculation, follow that along. The next morning is the year 4500, which was 740 CE. The second morning was the year 5500, 1740. And as we know, and as Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar himself knew, because he wrote these words in 1742, the redemption did not occur at that time. So Chaim Ben Attar is talking about mornings, saying Mashiach should come. Well, by the time he's writing it, it didn't happen. Mashiach hadn't come. And there'd been 2 mornings. Nonetheless, what does Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar mean by all this? He's hoping, as he writes it, he's hoping Mashiach will come soon. But he says, but what he's alluding to is the process of redemption did begin with the dissemination of the secret insights of Kabbalah, which, as the inner light of the Torah, is the taste of the new relations of Torah that will accompany the final redemption. In Kabbalistic thinking, in Hasidic thinking, the very idea of mystical ideas being brought to the public is itself part of the freeing, the redemption of the Jewish soul. To remember that mysticism, Kabbalah, even though we have Kabbalah from Sinai, since the Torah was given, it was held very close to the vest, and in the words of the Talmud, to 1 or 2 in a generation. So really, the Kabbalah per se was, while it was in the looser sense, the Jewish people, most Jewish people didn't have access to it. And that went on for many centuries. And then you'd have a few people, even if it was more than 1 or 2, who delved into Kabbalah, but that was not, it was, Kabbalistic knowledge was not known to much of the world. The first to bring it into lace it into something of his commentary was Nachmanides in the 1200s, but it was below the radar. When Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, when he started to print and disseminate, he said it's a mitzvah for people in general to know and to have a taste of the Kabbalah, and these are things which are spiritually awakening. And that was Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who was a Sephardi, and he was not Hasidic, but picking up that mantle, his mantle, 100 years later, was the founder of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Baal Shem Tov, who also definitely wanted to bring Kabbalistic ideas into the mainstream. So, although the dissemination of Kabbalah began to a limited extent with Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, known as the Arizal, who's 1534 through 1572, who expounded the teaching of Kabbalah to a small, exclusive circle of students, the process advanced and accelerated abruptly just before 1740. We started talking about 1740 as being that the morning of the millennium, and that's when it began, when the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, began teaching publicly, thereby propounding the doctrines of Hasidism, through which the insights of Kabbalah are made relevant and inspiring to people from all walks of life. So, following Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar's thinking, even though we did not have the Mashiach come, there wasn't the redemption in the sense that we have longed for it and it's described in our wisdom at that period of time, the morning, so to speak. The beginnings began. The beginnings came, and that was with the spreading of Hasidic thought. Following the same calculation, the year 5750, which was 1990, midway through the second half of the millennium, corresponding to high noon, if you take if you want to split the daylight into two, it'll be noon. It won't necessarily be 12 o'clock, but the half mark. If the dawn brought with it added light, starting us on the path of redemption, at this point, as we enter the radiance of the afternoon, redemption is surely imminent. They're quoting from something that Rabbi said in 1990. And look, pointed this and said, now we're heading into afternoon. There's got to be, the sun is high. God willing, he was very emphatic about those days of our commitment and conviction that Mashiach will come, which those days, and it still continues. This knowledge should stoke our intense yearning for the Messiah, as well as to spur us on to meaningfully prepare for his arrival through performing additional acts of goodness and kindness. This was very much the Rebbe's push in his last years of his life, was the idea of not only anticipating Mashiach, but it means change our lives, live as though we expect the world to change for good, live and put ourselves in that mental space where we're not held back by petty ideas and appetites and jealousies or whatever it is, and we free our best selves in connecting with loved ones and impacting the world to try and find our own internal Mashiach, and hopefully with that trigger the macro of Mashiach. Okay. So now we'll go back up on top. We're up to verse 3, because we did verse 1 and 2 on the prior page. Tending the fire on the altar. What the verse tells us is that every morning a person must be appointed to carry out the following procedure. The designated priest must don his linen tunic. But first, he must don his linen trousers directly on his flesh. So he has to put on, that's the way the Torah frames it. First, it mentions the tunic first, but if you want to talk about it in the way we usually speak in English, it's to put on his pants and then put on his tunic. Then after donning his tunic, he must first put on his turban and a linen sash. Then, so attired, dressed like that, he must, using a rake, lift out the innermost mass of ashes into which the fire has consumed the daily evening ascent offering, as well as the other offerings upon the altar. So we have an offering that was always brought to close out the day. So there's always something burning on the altar into the night. And his first thing is to go, and it's like it feels like sanitation. What he's doing is he's going and he's cleaning up and taking away the ashes. I'll get into that a little bit soon. If there are still any unconsumed portions of the sacrifices among these ashes, the priest must put them back into the fire to burn. The priest must then deposit these ashes next to the south side of the altar, to the east side of the ramp. Then similarly, the ashes of the inner altar and the ashes from the burnt wicks of the candelabra must be deposited at this location. There's other stuff to clean up from the night. So we take off the burnt wicks, the ashes, and we put it all there next to the south side of the altar on the southeast side. All these ashes will miraculously sink into the ground there. This daily removal and deposition of ashes is part of the sacrificial rite. It must therefore be performed by the priest attired in his priestly uniform. Despite the risk that these garments might be sullied by the ashes. As I said before, this is in a way a sanitation thing. So why is he getting all dressed up in priestly regalia? It's because this was a service. This was something that needed him to be in a certain frame of mind, and the clothing puts him in that frame of mind. And it's spiritually, that's for his service. He needed to wear his uniform. Even though his garments might get dirty, just as all the sacrificial rites, such as slaughtering, receiving, and applying blood, burning up, must be performed in the finery of the priestly uniform, despite the risk that these garments might become sullied thereby. So one of the things is that the ashes had a certain, and the removal of the ashes had a certain value, a certain ritual value, and therefore it was treated with great respect. And one of those signs of respect is that the priest had to wear the priestly regalia. So now let's go to the bottom of 37 on the right side, verse 3. You must lift out the ashes. Ash, the residue of something that has been consumed in flames, is the most physical aspect of solid matter, which stubbornly refuses to be transformed into energy or even into more subtle states of matter. Okay, that's what we experience anytime. You burn something, the combustion is it consumes, and the solid becomes a gas. It changes its molecular structure, but then there's something concrete and tangible, much more than smoke, left for us that we can actually touch. What they're saying that stubbornly refuses to be transformed into energy. In the case of the sacrifices, whereas the parts of the animal that are burned up and ascend heavenward signify the aspects of the physical world that can be made spiritual. So what are we doing? At one level, what we're doing is taking something physical, whether it's a flower, a cake, whatever it is that we're offering, our body of an animal. So we're taking something physical and we're consuming it with fire, and fire has its imagery to us as a spirituality, and it's almost like we're sending part of ourselves to God, something, a gift, and we're transforming something physical into something more ethereal, spiritual per se, but this smoke or a different, changing it into a less tangible molecular structure. Though, meaning those can be used either directly or indirectly in the performance of the commandments. The residual ashes signify the mundane necessities of life that remain outside the realm of a revealed holiness. So if you think about it in life, I have a chair. I have a chair, and it can be used in a synagogue, or it could be used in my house, used in my kids' playroom. But if we are able, in doing holy things and performing mitzvahs, we can bring much of the physical world into it, and it becomes transformed. So, for example, if I put together a tuna sandwich this morning, it's very mundane. It's a tuna sandwich. Whole wheat bread, tuna, mayonnaise. It's a sandwich. Then I go and I bring it to a neighbor who can't fend for themselves, who can't take care of themselves. It's a mitzvah. When I do that, I've taken something that seems very mundane and made it very holy. It's almost the idea like consuming something where it's physical, and now we've consumed its physicality, its grossness. What happens if I eat the tuna sandwich? I didn't do anything wrong. I want to use the energy for good stuff, but it wasn't a mitzvah per se. There's no mitzvah to eat a tuna sandwich. So I'm using it well. But what I'm doing really is I'm taking the mundane and I'm incorporating it into my life and using it meaningfully. And there's holiness there, but it's not a mitzvah per se. So what I'm saying is here, the idea of things that can be used either directly or indirectly in the performance of the commandments. That's what the body is that's being burned symbolizes. But the ashes signify the mundane necessity of his life that remain outside the realm of revealed holiness. There's the rest of my life, which is not unholy, but it's not part of the mitzvah pursuit. It's ashes. Now, what fate awaits these ashes? Torah provides two instructions. Once a day, the priest deposited a shovelful of ashes next to the altar, and when less frequently the accumulated ashes on the altar surface interfered with the fire pile, he removed them and took them outside the camp. So generally, they would go next to the altar, and every once in a while, he would take it outside the Jewish encampment. We have seen, what does this mean? We've seen how transmuting our self-oriented pleasure into God-oriented pleasure, as embodied in the rite of placing the fats of the sacrifice on the altar, bifurcates into the complementary aspects of know God in all your ways, experiencing divinity in mundane acts, and let all your deeds be for the sake of heaven, performing mundane acts without divine consciousness, but for divine purposes. The same complementary pair of intentions applies to how we relate to those aspects of light that we do not succeed in sanctifying, as embodied in the ashes of the sacrifice. So let's use the tuna sandwich idea. There's two different ways of looking at it. We say that we can somehow experience divinity, but in the actual act of eating the tuna sandwich, which we'll talk about. Or I'm not experiencing divinity, I'm eating a tuna sandwich. But what I want to do is I want to do it, use the energy to help me be who God created me to be, which is much easier. So now let's go further and let him unpack it. The ashes that are taken outside the camp allegorically refer to those mundane activities for which we cannot muster enough inspiration to transform them into holy acts. These aspects of one's life will remain outside the camp, outside the realm of holiness. Still, the Torah demands that they be brought to an undefiled place, meaning they should be ultimately utilized for the holy ends. To these aspects of our life, we may apply the words of the Mishnah, let all your deeds be for the sake of heaven. Sure, they're your deeds, mundane in nature, but let them serve a holy end. An example of this would be eating to satisfy hunger, but doing so with the intention that the food fuel our bodies and minds so we can study the Torah and perform its commandments. So that's one thing that is more common to us now, but there's another possible, more elevated side. Placing the ashes near the altar, this speaks and we'll go to page 38, a loftier way of performing mundane activities, to which we may apply the words of King Solomon, know him in all your ways. Here we transform the mundane activity itself into an experience of knowing God. Such an experience is worthy of a place near the altar. I think because he's finished it, we'll finish off their thing, but they haven't unpacked it adequately, in my opinion. Well, let's stick with the blockbuster exercise of eating a tuna sandwich. You know, the idea, normally, we sit down and eat a tuna sandwich because we're hungry. What does that have to do with God? What does that have to do with anything? It's the fact that I'm hungry. That is outside the realm of holiness. Because holiness is only there attached to an exercise where we have opened ourselves up, the exercise up to God. where it's not just about us. It's about what God wants from us. God has to be part of the equation, or it's not a holy equation. It's not Torah, it's not evil. It's just not unholy, just means it's not holy. Doesn't mean it's evil. And eating a tuna sandwich, unless it's a stolen tuna sandwich, is not going to be an evil thing. It's just not necessarily going to be evil. Holy. So, but let's say there's two ways to eat a tuna sandwich. When I sit down, I eat the sandwich, I make a blessing. Now, what do I make a blessing? Thanking God for creating this, if it's the bread. So they'll say that who brings forth bread from the earth. In other words, God created a world that provides for us in which we can find things. And it's not just the fact that there is such a thing as wheat, and there are mills that can make it into bread. It's the fact that I'm able to get it. I was able to purchase it, that God provides for us. I'm not just thinking about farms, we're thinking about our lives. So sitting down to eat a tuna sandwich, instead of me thinking about my appetite and whether I want, French fries with this, I'm thinking also, what am I? The thing is here, I'm thinking about, if I can have two ways to go. Is that I'm hungry, but I make a bracha and think, okay, I'm eating now, but I'm eating, and I hope to be able, in the course of the day, now that I have my blood sugars up and I have some strength, I want to be able to do good things with the energy. It's a beautiful thing. And maybe even if I think about it later, but I try to channel this energy into good things. Or I stop and I think of the blessing. I think, my gosh, yes, just the tuna sandwich, but I'm really a blessed guy. I'm able to. There are unfortunately too many people out there who have food challenges, and I'm in a position where I'm able to have this. I'm able to pay for needs for myself, and I'm in an environment where I can actually go buy it, and there's plenty. So the meal itself, even though maybe I'm having lunch with someone, I want to talk with them, and we're talking business or whatever we're talking about, baseball, but if I'm thinking to myself, if I bring God even for a moment before, and say, this is a blessing that I can even do this. And the experience itself is something that makes me feel grateful to God. And hopefully also the fact that I have this person I'm having lunch with. I mean, to feel the closeness to God in the exercise of eating the tuna sandwich, that's not just, do it in my deeds being for the sake of heaven. It's my deeds, and I do it in order to make a better world, which is a good thing. Better than that is knowing God in my life. Feeling God in all my ways, feeling in each area of my life, feeling God's blessing, God's closeness, and letting that guide how I pursue my appetites, and because eating can be healthy, and sometimes eating can be not so healthy, and thinking what God wants me. I'm just using eating as an example. Thinking about this as an exercise of closeness to God, it positions me better to be able to do the right thing, make the right choices as I'm going through the exercise. So he ends this off here. Still, the time for this ritual was fixed for the early morning before the sacrificial service proper began. As I said, every day it has its service, and the service began with an offering in the morning, right? Offering to begin the service, the shachar in the morning, and one for mincha, one for the afternoon. Afternoon that closed it out. But before the services, you had to prepare the altar, and part of preparing the altar was taking off the ashes in the evening. So it's an early morning. We didn't do it at night. It was an early morning service. This indicates that as exalted as this type of service is, it must nonetheless be considered only a preparation for a true task in life, studying the Torah and performing its commandments. What this is saying is that ultimately we have partaking in the material world is holy. it's great. It's important. It's something that where we can experience God and it gives God nachas. So, in theory, I could, if I could be home today, I could have a breakfast and I can have a lunch and I can have a dinner and I can take a walk and I can in the forest. I mean, there are things I can do to appreciate God in my life and to feel close to God. Those are all very good. Period. More intense is if I take some time and actually study some Torah or I do a mitzvah. That's even more. So while experiencing God in my lunch and in my physical life is a very important framing to my life, actually going physically, doing mitzvah, helping someone, or studying Torah, or the prayer, or doing something that's straight up holiness and godly, that's we want that should be a basis of our lives. That's not in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that finding God in the mundane is great, but it shouldn't only be about the mundane. How about the non-mundane? The non-mundane is just straight up Torah, and we all have access to that. Chabad.org, you can always study. Okay. So now, 1 second. So we're up to we'll get a little bit further. So you said you have to put on a linen sash. The Kohen had to put on a linen sash. The sash that the priest wore while performing the other parts of their sacrificial service was the only garment of the regular priest that contained the normally forbidden mixture of wool and linen. This is one of those off-the-run Torah fun facts. Torah tells us that we do not wear wool and linen. It's called shatnez. And that's it's a Torah prohibition, and it persists till today. And one would assume that when God prescribes a wardrobe, it's got to be a kosher wardrobe, and a kosher wardrobe doesn't have shatnez with this mixture of wool and linen. Yet, in the prescription for what was worn by the Kohen in the temple, the belt had shatnez. Right? So you had the rather strange reality that the Kohen wore a belt during the service, and if he wore it home, he would be violating outside the service. He'd be violating a prohibition, because while he was doing in the service, that's what the Torah told him to do. But outside the service, he's not allowed to wear shatnez any more than we are. So the sash that the priest wore while performing the other parts of the sacrificial service, the only garment of the regular priest that contained the normally forbidden mixture of wool and linen. When depositing the ashes next to the altar, or taking the accumulated ashes outside the camp, he wore a special sash made only of linen, like his other three garments. Why? Because he couldn't do it anymore. Being in the temple, he was allowed to do it. Once he was leaving, he's not allowed to wear shatnez. He would change if he was doing that service. Usually they're doing services in the temple. When he was doing that service of taking the ashes outside, he had to change his belt, because the sash. The reason was because he's not allowed to wear shatnez, wool and linen outside the temple or outside of the service. So, as explained previously, we've had it prior in the book of Exodus. The prohibition against wearing a garment made out of wool and linen is intended to prevent specific varieties of divine energy from extending into realms where their presence would be detrimental. Let's just finish this a little bit more. Let's try and explain it. While performing the sacrificial service, the priests ascended to such a sublime level of divine consciousness that there was no danger of negative influences, and therefore no impediment to wearing wool and linen together. This, however, was not the case when I think this is probably a little bit more fair. Let's try it now and see. We'll have to carry it over to next week. Idea of that the Torah, spiritually speaking, the idea that the Torah is concerned of because the Torah generally has a number of mitzvahs where we're separating milk and meat, we're separating wool and linen. We're not supposed to mate two animals of different species. It's to understand that there are lanes that God created, and that everybody, it's all one big jigsaw puzzle, and we all have to respect each other, and we all have to support each other. But we have to see who we are and keep the lanes clear. So that's as far as like blurring what we call blurring the lanes of reality. But here, spiritually, say there's another idea of overextending. If it was possible, say a person of let's say, I was counseling someone today who has a drug problem. Happens. And it would be a mitzvah for me to counsel them, to help them, to support them. But let's say I get so much into supporting them because I really want to be in one space with them, that they start to read that I'm not only supporting them, I'm supporting them in their drug habit. That's not good. A drug habit is not a good thing. I'm talking about an illegal drug habit. And therefore, for me to cross the line from being a counselor who's helping, saying, I don't believe in this, you're doing something self-destructive, and I'm going to try and help you, and I'm your friend, and I care about you, and I'm not judging you, but I'm trying to help you, that's healthy. If I kind of blur my own lines and I shift into, because of my attempt to add empathy and friendship, I become part of the problem, because he thinks, okay, so this guy also likes it. He's supporting what I'm doing. It's a danger. It's a danger for someone in my position. So now, and this could probably, I can't think of something that goes into normal civilian life, but these things are important, that to us to know where our position is, right? Position as a parent. I'm a parent. I want to be friends with my kids. And I don't want to be top down to my kids, but also to recognize that if I think there's something they're doing that's not good, I shouldn't telegraph that. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to judge you, but I want you to know what I think is right. So the blurring of the lines, the wool and linen represents the blurring of two different species, and blurring of the lines. And since that was something that we're concerned about, it says, let's just read this. As explained previously, the prohibition against wearing a garment made out of wool and linen is intended to prevent specific varieties of divine energy from extending to realms where their presence would be detrimental, which is kind of what I was talking about now. In the human form, the idea of bringing, here the drug counselor or the rabbi here is perceived or ends up supporting what I'm ostensibly working against, the drug habit. So there was a consciousness mechanism in staying away, always about staying away from wool and linen, while performing the sacrificial service. Since the sacrificial service was a time of heightened consciousness for the priest, and the priest ascended to such a sublime level of divine consciousness that there was no danger of negative influences, and therefore no impediment to wearing wool and linen together. In a very rarefied atmosphere, he could do it, because there was no danger of the priest slipping, of that idea of not recognizing our place and what we need to do in our role in life, because there was such a high consciousness. So there wasn't the need for the mitzvah. There wasn't the need for that prohibition of not mixing wool and linen. At the same time, this, however, was not the case when they were depositing or removing the ashes, the residue left behind from the sacrifice, which could not consume with its holy fire, but had to be discarded. Actually, let's continue this next week. It's a little longer topic. So, sorry, I didn't time that as well as I could have.
I have a question.
Sure.
What you just explained, is that where it says divine energy from extending into realms where the be detrimental?
Yeah, I was explaining that in a more human form.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that we for example, I mean, I don't know, we don't see where God's energy goes, right? Because I can't see. But the idea of recognizing that since we are lightning rods for God's energy, we want to be able to keep it in sacred places. So, if there's going to be some horrible Nazi rally going on somewhere, and someone says, but I like you, Rabbi. Will you come give us a blessing? It's not a place. It's not a venue that needs a blessing, and that it would be blasphemous to do the blessing there. I'm not drawing godliness into that area, that place. And to use a very pedestrian example.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So they explain here about why the negative was not applicable, but they don't explain the positive, why in fact he did wear the sash made of linen and wool. In other words, I can understand why he couldn't use it based upon what this is saying when removing the residual ashes. But why was it that he did wear it? Why use it at all?
So I guess I'm going to get into that when we get next time. When we get into this, we'll get into a little bit more, starting from a different vantage point about, because part of it, Roberta, and I don't want to, just say half words here, but ultimately, we live in a universe that's one, and it from a rarefied place, from a truly conscious place, we should be able to find for a place for all pieces of the puzzle, even the unholy pieces. And and the temple was a place like that. As a matter of fact, there's an opinion that one of the services had milk and meat together, cooked together, which was, you don't try this at home. But these important divisions were seen as necessary when there was a normal human consciousness, which is not heightened. When there's heightened spiritual consciousness, there's the capacity to and we make sure not to delude ourselves into thinking we have it, but there is the capacity to encompass everything.
Okay.
All right, we'll get more into it next week.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a great week, everybody.
You too.